In this section on flexibility, I am going to predominantly do floor-based activities for improving or developing flexibility, which means most of these holds are going to be for north of 20 seconds, probably north of 30 seconds, to elicit a stretch reflex dampening down twice. Now, we will look at PNF, we will look at static stretching, we will look at static active stretching. And each one of these has its own merits and benefits for a specific reason. When we're talking PNF, like at the base level, as a personal trainer in the UK in the qualification, they teach you to PNF. Hamstring, they teach you to PNF. Quads, they teach you to PNF. Pecs, lats, and possibly even biceps, some institutions do. And when you're thinking about the exercises and the exercise selection or the stretching selection for the right muscles, you have to ask the question, well, if I can straighten my arm with my palm facing up, and maybe even move it out to the side, do I really need to PNF my biceps? Possibly not. If I can sit in this position, do I really need to PNF my quads? If my bum, my butt, my glutes are sat on my heels, I have pretty good knee flexion, do I really need to PNF my quads? Possibly not. Hamstrings, mostly dysfunctional and tight and short in a lot of people. Hip flexors, tight, short in a lot of people. Pecs, tight, short in a lot of people. And this is due to lifestyle factors of sitting in a chair, sitting at a desk, driving a car. These things get dysfunctional because they're underused or understretched. So the bang for your buck PNF exercises would be, PNF stretches would be for the hip flexors, would be for the hamstrings, would be for the pecs. I will talk through, because in the main talk, the main seminar of this, that this video accompanies, I have talked about doing the splits, and I've talked about self-PNFing your hip group to enable you to fully get into a split position. So I will talk through a self-PNF for the adductor group as well to enable you to do side splits, should you wish. But again, asking yourself, do I really need to do the side splits if I play soccer, football, basketball? Then the answer is probably no. So you don't need to do all of the stretches that I'm talking about in this seminar to be able to perform your activity. But to regain function over dysfunctional muscles, tight muscles, weak muscles in effect, then there are horses for courses in terms of stretching you can do for you as an individual. Rather than general set of rules, it needs to be tailored to you. And you'll only know what that feels like when you start trying them. Because if I'm saying do a 30-second hold and your stretching gets better after 15 seconds, the pain reduces, I mean, then your window is 15 seconds to 20 seconds rather than 30 to 35 seconds. So when we're talking about timing, please try it and see how it feels for you as an individual rather than strict set of textbook rules, because they're just general guidelines. Okay, let's look at the hip flexor. This is the first place I go when I'm looking to improve people's posture or try to reduce lower back pain or improve performance, because 9 times out of 10, the hip flexors are tight and short, therefore being slightly dysfunctional. So for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use my left hip flexor through this talk and tutorial. Now, the aim of this is to take the hip flexor where it, and I'm saying hip flexor generally because I'm talking about the hip flexor group, but the muscles, the group of muscles that flex the hip. In this case, I'm trying to get the hip into an extended state. So what I'm looking to do here is to take my pelvis as far in front of my knee as I can, if the plumb line was here. So opening up the hip flexor here and keeping my shoulders facing forwards is the key to stretching this hip flexor in the sagittal plane, staying straight forward. So I'm going to turn my attention to you, and so that you guys can see, this is exactly the way I'm aiming for. Now you should not be able to see my foot behind me here, because everything kind of on train tracks, I'm moving in the sagittal plane. Pelvis is facing forwards, feet are facing forwards. Now my back foot, if this is just a static stretch, all I'm aiming to do is to sink into position, and I can just simply collapse my back foot. I say this is dead toes. Toes alive, toes dead. Okay, but you can keep them If you keep the heel up and the toes alive, this means you have a little bit more control over the movement. This is a complete static stretch, which tends to switch the proprioceptors off because you're in a relaxed state. And we will stay here for the duration of a static stretch. Anything developmental, as I want to keep 30 to 40 seconds. Looking at the hip flexor through the sagittal plane as we've just done, the next step into advancing this is to take the foot and make it a little bit wider. So I'm going to take my right foot and just shuffle it over to the right, but still keep my torso facing forwards. And what you'll find now is that you're trying to work or stretch the hip flexor through the frontal plane. I've added a little bit more abduction to my pelvis, thus stretching the adductor group that are responsible for also flexing the hip. So my femurs now are almost like in an apex position, thus abduction occurring at the pelvis here and stimulating the hip flexors or stretching the hip flexors in the frontal plane. My back foot in this instance is alive, my toes are curled under and my heel is elevated. It's not collapsed and relaxed, it's alive and in control. So this is a second solution of working the hip flexor through the frontal plane, which, if you know any performance related activity, requires the hip flexors to work through the sagittal, frontal and transverse plane. Just a static stretch. And we'll bring that stretch off. Now there is a way to work the frontal plane into a static active stretch. So if I assume this position again, so I'm going to bring the hip flexors back in through the sagittal plane. I might creep it out slightly through the frontal plane and hold it here. If I'm looking for a little bit more abduction, which is typically what you find in the frontal plane, I'm going to move my torso to the left and to the right. So if I come straight, face the camera straight on this one, okay, so I've got the sagittal stretch on, I've got the frontal plane stretch on because I've wiggled my foot out a little bit, and right now I'm going to tilt my shoulders to the right, tilt my shoulders to the left. And what this does, it takes the whole spine into lateral flexion, both ways, to left lateral flexion and right lateral flexion, thus putting a little bit of a tilt on the pelvis and telling the proprioceptors of the hip flexors, hey, I need motion in the frontal plane here, and I'm doing this gently so that you can get used to giving me this range in an extended position. So it's not rapid, it's not quick, it's just gradually activating the proprioceptors whilst they're in a stretched state. And it's safe to do if you do this under control. Looking at the hip flexor, the major hip flexor group here of my left hip in a transverse plane. So we're trying to stretch it through the transverse plane, which means we need to add some rotation to it. Now, for me, anything that you are trying to stimulate, work, train, stretch in the transverse plane needs to go through the sagittal and frontal plane as well to get the best stimulation from the proprioceptors and the fibers within that muscle and or muscle groups. So here we go. If I move, as I've done in the previous two tutorials, I'm going to come into the sagittal plane, static hold, move my foot wider in the frontal plane, static hold. So now my femurs are representing some sort of apex position. This is the fun bit. This is where I start to stimulate my hip flexor here through the transverse plane. Now, looking at the heel being elevated and my toes are alive, this is what's going to control this movement. So if you think about my hip flexor being stretched sagittal and frontal slightly here, now I'm going to start to collapse my back foot in, which takes the femur into external rotation, thus moving the hip flexor through the transverse plane, as it's already through the frontal and the sagittal. And then I might just collapse my heel out, which takes my femur into an internal rotation position, and just gently rotate through the transverse plane here. And my pelvis is staying still, so that the proximal part of my hip flexor is rigid, depicting here in this hand, and the distal part is rotating because it's attached to the femur. This is a method of working your hip flexor through the transverse plane. And you'll see if you pay attention to the knee that's in front, there's also, as I rotate in, this knee wants to rotate out slightly. So I'm also getting the benefits of the hamstring, the proximal hamstrings and glutes of my front leg, adding a bit more transverse motion through it. Even though I'm thinking about concentrating on my rear hip flexor, my left hip flexor, my right leg also in unison helps. One of the most bang for your buck exercises to dampen down the A-tight hip flexor is to assume the hip flexor stretch position, okay, whilst bringing the quad into play by lifting up the rear heel. So in my previous tutorials, we've talked about stretching the hip flexor in a static stretch and a static active stretches in the different planes. So I'm just going to come into the sagittal plane on this one. I'm going to bring my hips forward into that hip flexor stretched position. I'm going to place my hands onto my thigh to keep my torsos upright, which is enabling my pelvis to stay still, if not slightly posteriorly tilted, which is the best position for your hip flexors to be in. And from here, I'm going to pick my foot up and place it into my hand and pull my heel into my glutes. Now this position, bringing the quad into play here, it also dampens down the femoral nerve. It tells every proprioceptor of the anterior chain of the hip flexor group to calm down. And the more you can stay in this position and you can just breathe through it and let the pain go, let the stretch reflex go, you're telling the proprioceptors of this hip group, hey, I'm in control of what I'm doing. And the longer you can stay here, the quicker it will start to dampen down or quieten down any tight muscles that you have here. And relax slowly back to the start position and flex the hip out of it. Okay, looking at the hamstring group. Now we've gone through tutorials on the hip flexor before, and I've used my left hip flexor. I'm going to use my right hamstring group on this one for the demonstration purposes. So the most bang for your buck hamstring exercise to do is to come into this position, because you need to think that you are trying to get the hamstring into a full extended position, which means if I'm up in this position and my hips and my pelvis is neutral and I straighten my right leg, okay, I'm going to tilt forwards from the pelvis, and this is going to take my hamstring, the proximal part of my hamstring and the distal part, away from each other as I hinge forwards into it. Okay, you need to be mindful, and here is the thing about stretching the hamstring. Most people will have you be in this sagittal plane position and it's just flex forwards from the hips. However, when you're talking about performance, there is a fair chance that when you're throwing your right leg forward, your pelvis needs to turn as well to reach for, kick, move away from whatever it is. It's very seldom that you will work in one plane of motion. So when people talk to me about stretching the hamstring, and I allow the pelvis to twist slightly for my students and my clients when this happens, is because that is has a greater functional carryover to most tasks than simply staying in this position and hinging forwards. Pain management is a different story, right? We need to make sure that we're working through separate planes for that. But when I'm looking for hamstring performance out of something like an axe kick, for example, or a roundhouse kick, or some sort of movement that I need to decelerate hip flexion, I will allow the pelvis to twist on this to enable everything else to assist that hamstring to do its job. So in this case, when I'm looking for just a sagittal plane hamstring, I'll just fold over from the hips and stretch in this one plane of motion. And hands, again, parallel, I will reach forwards. If anything, I will reach slightly further with the left hand. And what you'll see is now, you'll see my lumbar spine and my thoracic spine start to flex as my shoulder protracts forward. And again, I am okay with this. It takes my posture out of a neutral alignment, but I'm absolutely okay with this, because when you sprint, there is a fair chance, for instance, there is a fair chance that you're going to round the upper shoulder somewhere, which is going to have a knock-on effect through the thoracic and lumbar. Looking at a method of stretching the hamstring through the sagittal plane and the frontal plane is very similar to the way that we would do the hip flexor. So I'm going to have my right foot in front, heel down into the floor, toes pointing upwards for this, and I'm going to hinge forwards in this sagittal plane. Now you can have something nearby if you wish to hold on for balance, that's absolutely fine. I would like to try and get my clients to reach down to the floor if possible. Now, with this sagittal plane hip flexor stretch, you can get away with placing one hand either side of the hamstring here, so either side of the leg to simulate the hamstring in one plane of motion, because this will ensure that your pelvis stays square. However, what I'm asking you to do now is to take your front foot, the stretched leg, and place it out to the side. So I'm working on kind of a V position. Similar to when we did the hip flexor, we work on an A-frame or an apex. We're working on a V position now, or I guess as the camera's looking, that would be an apex where my left knee is here and my right knee is here. But I'm slightly abducting my femurs from the pelvis. Then I'm going to reach my hands in front. So you'll see that my foot, my hamstring in this case, is being stretched in the frontal plane because I have some slight abduction going on at the hip. So again, this is a static stretch. Moving on through the planes of motion and a hamstring stretch, we are going to look at how to stretch the hamstring in all three planes of motion. So adding in the transverse plane to this hamstring stretch. Now my preferred method of doing this is to have a static active stretch. Not to be confused with dynamic and certainly not to be confused with ballistic. This is holding a static stretch and making it active by moving through a different plane of motion slightly and under control. So let's go back to hamstring stretch number 2, which in this case would be the sagittal plane, pelvis forwards, and the frontal plane because I have my foot and my femur slightly abducted from the pelvis, from neutral, from its equilibrium. And I'm placing my hands onto the floor to fully stimulate the stretch of my hamstring here. And what I'm going to do is use my foot, my front foot, the toes that I'm currently wiggling, and I'm going to collapse my foot in and out, in and out. So this is not only taking my foot in and out, it's taking tib fib, it's taking femur, and it's rotating my whole leg through the transverse plane whilst it's being held in a frontal plane and a sagittal plane stretch. You'll find that most performance-based activities will require you to move the hamstring, to stretch the hamstring, to activate, to have strength and power through the hamstring in all three planes of motion. One of the most advanced versions of getting stimulation through the hip flexor and the hamstring would be at the same time, possibly even the quad at the same time. So there is a lot going on here, and it's not necessarily recommended for beginners, but it's something to work up to. Not only are we now trying to get the most stimulation from the hip flexor as we can, and if you look at this, with any luck, I'm hoping for a plumb line to be going from this knee through my pelvis right the way down to that knee there. So it's pretty much a straight line, or close to. Now from this position, what we're going to aim to do is to straighten the front leg. So you'll see this is going to follow some sort of box split position. So, and then once I'm getting stuck on the mat, I'm going to wiggle my foot forward through the transverse plane, which will give me a little bit more movement at the hamstring. Now from here, this is, my pelvis is rotated slightly. And you'll find this happens in most cases when it comes to doing this version of the split. For performance-based activities, again, your pelvis will rotate. It's highly unlikely that you will be able to keep a neutral pelvis, i.e. on train tracks facing forward through the sagittal plane, get this decent level of hamstring stretch and hip flexor stretch at the same time. Now the next step in this sequence would be to pick up the foot and pull it into the glutes. So I've got my hip flexor, my quads, and my hamstrings all being stretched at the same time. There's a lot going on here. Okay, I'd like to look at a self PNF for the hamstring, or the hamstring group. When, as a personal trainer in the UK, at the baseline level of education that you get, you are taught to PNF your clients. Now, when you're talking about developing flexibility, we would like to try and empower our clients to stress themselves on their own as well, which is what this whole tutorial and series is about. So one of the quickest ways I have found to improve flexibility and strength in a muscle is through PNF stretching, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. You're essentially tricking the muscle into thinking it's longer than it is. So when I do this, right, I am going to try to PNF the hamstring alone. So I'm going to leave the back hip out of this. And I brought a stool in case when you're trying this at home, don't sacrifice the stretch that you're trying to achieve for lack of balance. So have something nearby to hold on to should you need to. Now, what we're aiming to do with a PNF, just to keep this simple, we're going to work on a ratio of a 30-second hold to a 15-second contraction. Okay, it will vary from person to person, as in how long you hold when the stretch reflex eases off, how long you can contract for, what strength you can contract for. It is very much an individual basis rather than a cookie cutter approach. So what I'm aiming to do, just for demonstration purposes here, we're going to hold it for 30 seconds, contract for 15, hold for 30 seconds, contract for 15, and hold for 30 seconds. It is as simple as that at this level. All right, so we're going to get into my hamstring stretch position, which for me it's approximately here, and I'm just going to hold the stool just for a little bit of balance. Okay, so my hamstring stretch kicks in around about here, and we're going to hold it for 30 seconds. And now we're going to contract it, so we're going to ease the stretch off a little bit, and we're going to dig the front heel into the floor. So you're going to try to do a hamstring curl into the floor, and you're going to hold this contraction for 15 seconds. 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Relax that contraction and try to push the hamstring into a little bit more of a stretch. And we're going to hold it again here for 30 seconds. And get ready to contract again. 3, ease off, 2, 1, and dig that heel into the floor. So flex the knee, contract the hamstring. Try to do a hamstring curl into the floor. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, dig, 14, 15, and relax the stretch. And for the last time now, see if you can just wiggle that foot forwards a little bit further and hold for 15 seconds. 30 seconds, hold for 30 seconds. Okay, so looking at an adductor group stretch, adductor. I'm going to come into this kneeling position, this upright kneeling position, and I'm going to place my my left foot out to the left. And what I'm going to aim to do here is creep my right knee out as well. So I'm bringing myself into an apex position with the femurs. Now this is just getting the adductor groups, okay? There's a lot of confusion when it comes to stretching the adductors, that people will sit in a straddle position, but even just by sitting in a straddle position, your pelvis is flexed. What we're trying to do, if we're just trying to isolate the adductor group or groups, is to keep the pelvis neutral or upright as we put the leg out into abduction. By abducting the leg, I'm stretching the adductors, and I'm just going to hold this position. If I want to stretch this a little bit further, I'm going to take my right hand up over the top, my left hand on the thigh, and I'm going to creep over by laterally flexing my spine. This further stretches the adductor group of my left leg. Following on from just a static, strict adductor stretch, I'm going to come back into my maximum stretch position here, but this time I am going to collapse my back foot and sit my hips backwards onto that foot. So you have to have some decent level of knee flexion on the base leg here, the supporting leg, to assist. Now what's happened is here with my foot flat on the floor, I've still got my adductor, my adductor stretch on, but my pelvis is tilted. So it's enabled me to tilt forward slightly, which also gets some of the proximal hamstrings involved as well. Now the beauty of holding this in position is that I can manipulate my torso to fully extend this stretch in my adductor and hamstring group of my left leg by rotating towards my front foot. So it is static, but it is active because I am moving my torso into, possibly and out of position. But to make it a completely static stretch, we will just hold. Now I'd like to talk about a self-PNF for the adductor group, the adductor group. So in previous tutorials we've talked about how to isolate one side of the adductors just on its own, or adding a little bit of flexion in so you get the sagittal plane in there as well, and a little bit of hamstring. So one of my favorite exercises to do is this PNF for the adductors, because I've always been a fan of 80s movies and watching Jean-Claude Van Damme do the splits between chairs, and I've always wanted to do that and maintain it. It really serves no purpose for my performance in daily activity, but as a martial artist, that level of flexibility in the frontal, sagittal and transverse plane for the whole hip group, AB, AD, ductors, the hip flexors and the hamstrings and glutes, is a must for optimum kicking. Anyway, so I brought a stool in for this one to place in front of me because I will need some support, okay? And I recommend you guys do the same thing because, again, I would rather you not sacrifice the stretch that you're trying to achieve for a lack of balance whilst trying it. So we are going to hold onto the stool, bring your right leg out to the side in an adductor position or an abducted position, and then your left foot out to the side in that similar position. So the trick is to allow yourself to go as low to the floor as you can in this stretched position passively. So this is where you hold on to something and you say, right, that's enough for my hip flexors. This is enough for my adductors, thank you. And then you stay. So you have the stool there to lean onto to take the stress out of the adductors and just stretch them. So this is your 30-second hold. Bring the stretch off slightly, flex your knees so that you have complete control, ever so slightly flex, and take your hands off the stool and try to ruffle the mat underneath for a 15-second count. So nothing is being held, just the strength of my adductors here. After the 15 seconds, place your hands or your elbows back onto the support and just see if your feet can slide a little further. There's a chance that they can. And then you're going to hold this position for 30 seconds. Then you're going to slack it off slightly, flex your knees, take one hand away, take the other hand away, squeeze for 15 seconds. Place your hands down, back onto the stool, and just have a further 30-second hold to stretch. Sit yourself down, bring your legs in, shake them off. let's look at stretching the glutes. Now, the typical glute position that people get into is a pigeon or a modified pigeon stretch. And that's absolutely cool. It's going to get the glutes in all three planes. So I would like to start this. We're going to look at my left glute here. Okay. I'm going to come into an all fours position, and I'm going to keep my toes alive. I'm going to take my right knee and place it to the outside of my left ankle. Okay, so now what happens here, I'm not going to slide my hips further back. I'm just trying to work my glute here in the frontal plane and the sagittal plane. So I flex my knee from my pelvis, and I'm just tilting my glutes or pushing my glutes to the left. And just this position alone gets the lateral head of the glute, the top end of glute med. Of course, you've got glute max in there as well. However, this tilt, the advancement on this now, we're going to reach through and get a little bit more glute mid than we are glute max. Come out of it slowly. So I'm going to hold this position, but I'm going to change the angle so that you can see me from a slightly different angle. So from here, I place my right foot, my right knee behind my left ankle, and I tilted to the camera, to the left, into a left tilt, so adducted the left hip. My next progression from here is I am going to maintain this position and take my right knee as far back as I can so that my glute pretty much hits the floor. So now I've got good knee flexion here, okay, my knees are okay, and I've had good adduction and flexion from this hip. Now the further I twist down and sit my chest towards my knee, I've got a lot more internal rotation happening at the pelvis and at the femur. So I have hit all three planes of motion with this one glute stretch. Now the angle of the knee, the angle of my front knee, my left knee here, is I've pretty much got my calf on my hamstring. The wider this angle goes, the more proximal hamstring and distal glutes I get. Not wrong, just slightly different stretch than just the glutes alone. So by tucking this in, it's predominantly just glutes. If I want glutes and top hamstring, then I open the angle of this knee and I have to move my pelvis a little bit more towards the ankle here as I start to pull myself forwards. Hope that makes sense. I'd like to look at the lats. Now, most people stretch the lats by using a stand-up bar. We're going to do it floor-based in this case. So by a stand-up bar, I mean hanging off of something or holding onto a door frame. But for a routine that is just mat or floor-based, this is one of my favorite versions of a lat stretch to do, that we can hit multiple planes with it. So most people will come into it in this position. I'm coming off the mat slightly, I appreciate that. Is some sort of child's pose for this, and that's great, okay? However, if you can pretty much put your hands up to the sky and make your biceps touch your ear, your lats are in a pretty good extension anyway. So begs the question, how much do I need to stretch them if I can do that? And I believe that needs to be the question for every stretch when it comes to should I do it or shouldn't I do it, okay? However, this is one of my favorite tweaks to do with a lat stretch. So from this position, and as I sink back into the child's pose, before I fully get into this position, I'm going to put my right hand on the floor and hold on to the top of it with my left hand. And now as I sink in, I've got a deeper pull on my right hand side because it's being anchored by my left hand. So what I'm going to aim to do on this one, as I sink down through my hips flexing in that sagittal plane, I'm just going to push into my left shoulder. So I'm going to sink down a little bit deeper and put my head through my arms and push into my into my right shoulder, which is further stretching just the right hand side of my lats. Come back to the center, come out of it, swap hands over, sink down deep and push into the left shoulder. By anchoring the hands, what you'll find is that the
the distal part of the lats and the proximal, the origin and the insertion, get a really good stretch here. I'm even getting a little bit of QL on my left-hand side because it's a little tight with me. Come back to the center and come out of it nice and slowly.
Looking at a static active stretch for my deltoids and the rotator cuff in this case. So I'm going to bring my left hand across the front of my body. I'm going to hug it in to my torso. Now it's my left arm that I'm stretching. So I've got the rear delts kicked in quite nicely here, a little bit of medial delts as well. And what I'm going to now do is take my palm and turn it up to the ceiling, back over, not only to the floor, but as internal as I can get it. So I'm going to rotate my palm as far in as I can. Serve it up, push it down. Now this gentle rotation going on at the humerus, it starts to rotate the humerus in, I guess, the shoulder socket at the shoulder joint, which is stimulating my rotator cuff, the posterior muscles of my rotator cuff here, which is crucial in terms of any sort of throwing or punching or lifting activities. Pressing. And relax. I like to hold that in the static position for a good 30 seconds with a nice slow rotation. I'll probably get 10 to 12 good rotations with each hold that I do. Looking at my pec, okay, I'm going to stretch the left pec in this case, and there's a lot going on. It's not just a pec that I'm stretching here. As I come into this position, which I'm fairly certain most of you have seen before, but as I come into this position, there's hip extension, there's hip abduction and external rotation, there's spinal rotation, there's oblique and ab stretch going on at the same time. So this, for me, when I'm stretching my pec, I'm getting more bang for my buck because I have a lot of other things going on in that anterior chain being stretched. So for demonstrations, I am going to come to, okay, so for the demonstration of this, I'm going to come and I'm going to lay on my tummy and I'm going to put my left hand out to the side facing the camera in line with my shoulder. Now my palm flat on the floor means I can hold on and I can brace if I need to turn this into a PNF stretch. My right hand is at my right shoulder and I'm going to attempt to do a right side press up, which as I lift my right side of the torso, my left shoulder gets pushed into the floor here. I'm going to continue this rotation and I'm going to take my right foot into flexion at the knee and I'm going to place it behind my left knee here, which opens up my hip. As long as my left foot stays flat on the floor and my right knee rotates over towards the camera, there's a lot going on now. And I appreciate I'm facing away from the camera and I will swap sides in a second, but my left pec and my left deltoid area, my anterior deltoid and bicep are getting a really, really good stretch. So I'm going to come out and for demonstration purposes this time, I'm going to do a static stretch on my pec, but a static active stretch. I'm going to do a PNF stretch for my right pec so that you can see you can self-PNF certain muscles. And the pec is one that you probably should PNF. Given today's climate where we're all in this position, this muscle group gets tight and short. So we need to not only work the strength of the posterior pulling muscles, but also the flexibility of my anterior pushing muscles by pecs and deltoids in this case. So I'm going to lay down on my tummy. My right hand goes out to the side, out to the right, in line with my right shoulder. And I perform exactly the same as I did on the left side with a static stretch. I'm going to rotate into this position and I'm going to hold for 30 seconds. When I come out of this stretch, I'm going to come out slightly, only slightly. I'm going to take a stretch off at about 10% off. And I'm going to pull, like I'm trying to do a chest fly. I'm going to push the palm of my right hand into the floor. Slightly bend the elbow and force it into the floor so I'm contracting my pec. And if you're unsure what PNF is, follow the main part of this seminar and there's a talk on it. There's a section on PNF in that talk. to stop the contraction and just add a little bit more rotation in so I can get a little bit of a wider range on my pec now. "30-second hold." Ease off the rotation a little bit more, and this time I'm going to do another chest flight, push my right palm into the floor for 15 seconds, contracting that pec. And relax. And you should be able to rotate it a little bit further this time again. I'd like to talk about the importance of a lunge matrix, or lunges in general, for improving the mobility and the dynamic flexibility of the muscles, mobility of the joints, and the dynamic flexibility of the muscles and proprioceptors of the muscles for the hip and the hip actions. So when we look at 3 planes of motion, we have flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and we have internal and external rotation. And in a previous tutorial or in a previous video I've gone through the mobility, specific mobility for the 3 planes: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal, external rotation. So I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to talk about how to stimulate the muscles around the hip joint by using lunges. Okay, specifically anterior lunges, posterior lunges, lateral lunges, and transverse lunges, because they have a real bang for your buck in terms of output. Okay. Okay. So if we start with an anterior lunge, a forward lunge, okay, and for demonstration purposes, I'm going to move my left leg in this instance, okay. So I'm going to flex my hip, and as I move into this anterior lunge, my whole purpose of doing this is to stretch the muscles of the glutes, proximal hamstrings, lower back, upper back, and by driving my arms forward through this lunge, I'm going to stimulate the proprioceptors of the muscles of the posterior chain of my body. Okay, so in fact, I'm going to come this way, so that when you see me lunge on my left leg, and I'm going to take a mid-shin reach and collapse my chest towards my knee, I get the flexion I'm looking for at the hip, thus extending my glutes, and spring back up to the start. So I'm going to take an anterior lunge with a bilateral hand reach, mid-shin as far as I can. This is a solution to get my glutes to decelerate this hip flexion. As my glutes lengthen, the proprioceptors are saying, "Hey, hip joint, what are you doing?" and spring me back up. So that's when I get the stretch reflex of the glutes and the proximal hamstring here. So again, lunge and reach, anterior lunge and reach. Again, contrary to popular textbook lunges where they get you to keep your torso upright, I understand that if you're looking for the strength of the legs in that case. However, I'm looking for the mobility of the hip in that sagittal plane. You can play around with the ranges. I can do a shallow lunge with a shallow reach. I can do a really deep lunge with a really deep reach, depending on your level of expertise in lunging. Now we're going to look at the anterior chain of my hips, my body, when it comes to lunging. So if I'm looking to use a forward lunge to decelerate that and stimulate the proprioceptors and muscles of my glutes in this case, opposing muscles being the hip flexors, I'm going to take it into extension. I need to take it into extension. So I'm going to take a posterior lunge with a bilateral hand overhead reach and come back up to start. So this is going to extend my whole hip flexor chain, anterior chain, rectus abdominis, obliques, pecs, as I reach my hands over my head. To decelerate, the whole point of this is to stimulate the muscles that decelerate hip extension. So posterior lunge with overhead reach. And I follow my hands over my head, so that gives me complete extension through the hips, lumbar, thoracic, cervical spine. And spring back up to the start. So you're looking to stop the lunge and the reach pretty much at the same time. So these muscles act like a big elastic band to fire back up to the start. Like I've explained in tutorials in the past for this symposium and other talks and seminars that I've done, if I'm a kicker, I need my hips to come into extension before they come into flexion. If I'm kickboxing, same thing. I load my back hip, boom, before I fire my leg out into a kick. So when we're talking flexibility for performance or functional flexibility, I absolutely need my hips to decelerate extension if I'm looking for quick flexion. Opposite action for reaction, or reaction to action. Load, explode for whatever kicking, whatever task you need it to. But having good deceleration of extension is a must when it comes to performance. So anterior lunge and posterior lunge, forwards lunge and backwards lunge with the reaches in the directions that I've described will be a good solution to dynamic flexibility for the sagittal plane using a lunge. Looking at the frontal plane, I need to take my hips into abduction and adduction if I'm looking to stimulate the muscles of the hip in that plane of motion. So I'm going to use my left hip again as an example. If I'm looking to stretch my left hip in the frontal plane, I take my right foot into a lateral lunge, which is going to give my adductors a stretch because the pelvis is coming away from the femur. I'm not necessarily paying attention to what this leg and this foot is doing right now. I'm just paying attention to my left hip. If my foot is flat on the floor as I drop into this lateral lunge, I'm going to get good, and my torso is upright, I'm going to get good deceleration of adduction. My adductors are going to slow down this abduction, of my pelvis, and then bring me back up to the start. Now I am trying to keep my torso as upright as possible. So in this position, if I could just drop into this position, with the sagittal plane, we drove the hands forwards and we drove the hands back. As if we do that here, we're going to flex the hip, and it's going to give us a false positive in how well my hip, my left hip in this case, abducts. Okay? So what I'm aiming to do is not reach forwards or backwards with this. I'm going to take my hands up and reach over to the foot that is not moving. If I bring my arms up like a seesaw, that's one method of doing it. I could take both hands up over my head or even on my head and tilt and reach. The whole point here is when I'm in this abducted state at my pelvis and I've laterally flexed my upper torso, I've got a greater stretch from my inner thigh and all of the muscles that are usually responsible for adducting my hip. If I'm in an abducted state, my adductors are trying to decelerate that. They're slowing it down. Thus, the proprioceptors at the origin and insertion, let's just say, of my adductor group right now, they're slowing down to fire me back up to the start. So they're getting stimulated every time I do this motion. So in summary, doing a lateral lunge with a bilateral hand overhead reach to the same foot that is not moving is a great way to stimulate the adductors of that group that you might need to throw a kick. I use kickboxing as an example because that's my sport. Obviously the same on the other foot. So looking at the abductor group, the abductor group. Now, whereas adductors get stimulated by stretching this way, the abductors get stimulated by stretching the opposite way. So I need to take my pelvis closer toward my femur in order to stretch the abductor group of the hip. In this case, we're looking at the glutes. So I'm going to give myself a slight bend in the knee, and I'm going to alternate a posterior crossover lunge with an anterior crossover lunge. And my left foot does not move, my base foot doesn't move. Crossover backwards, crossover forwards. And we loosely use the term lunge on this because I'm not turning it into a curtsy lunge. I'm stepping behind to stimulate the origin and insertion of my glutes through the frontal plane. In front, behind. Very subtle movement, but quite a great stretch. Now I'm tilting my body to the right as I do this. So I'm moving my foot to the left, tilting my body to the right. So I'm going to do the similar sort of thing with my hands to drive a little bit more motion into the hip as I did with the sideways or lateral lunge. I'm going to put my hands up into the air, just gently above my head, so not a full reach. And as I step in, I'm going to tilt to the side. So whereas I'm just using the term abductor group for the hips, when you start to do this, you'll get a full dynamic stretch through the whole lateral chain of the core. Posterior and anterior. So looking to stimulate my glutes in the transverse plane by using a lunge. The easiest method of doing this is to do a inverted forward lunge. And by that I mean, as I land my foot in front, I land it internally rotated. So as I land it internally rotated, I drop my back knee toward the floor. My femur now is flexed, adducted, and internally rotated as I'm dropping my back knee down. To have a little bit more range through this, bringing my torso into left rotation. Left foot in front, left rotation. So I'm driving more transverse plane here by rotating my hands into a left rotation or left rotated state to stimulate the left glutes. You can take this from a parallel stance to have it a little bit more realistic to things like a court sport or field sports. And then the opposite of internal rotation is external rotation, which is very similar to the mobility section that we did. I'm going to keep my foot flat, left foot flat on the floor. I'm going to take my whole pelvis and lunge away onto my right foot, but my left foot doesn't move. Right, both hands drive the same way as my right foot is going. So I'm taking my right foot, placing it round on a clock face to 5 or 6, externally rotating my femur at the joint and rotating my hands around with it. And you'll find there's adequate stimulation of the hip flexors and the quads and even the hamstrings, depending on how far you can go round, proximal parts of the hamstrings in this case, to pull you back. You feel like the decelerating extension, decelerating external rotation, decelerating abduction every time you do it. If you combine every one of these lunges together, forwards, backwards, lateral lunges, crossover lunges, anterior and posterior, transverse lunges with a reach, transverse lunges with a reach, into a sequence, we call them a matrix. A lunge matrix is a perfect way to get mobility, get dynamic stretching, to switch on the whole proprioceptive system of the body before you do a workout. For me, it's my go-to warm-up, for want of a better phrase, but preparation set before I have anybody do any type of workout, be it under the bar, be it HIIT stuff, be it sandbag or kettlebells. Priming the hips through all 3 planes of motion has a knock-on effect to the knee, to the foot and ankle, to the shoulders, to the thoracic spine, lumbar spine, cervical spine. It pretty much gets everything stimulated. So have a go at a lunge matrix. On both legs, not just the one. I chose one for demonstration purposes. You have 2, hopefully, try them both.